He is probably the best known Palestinian filmmaker today. That's not saying much because there aren't a lot of them. Some of you may remember the show Arab Labor that was on TV. So there is absolutely an industry of Palestinian film industry, but it is small and it is very interdependent on Israel. And we will be talking about the relationship between the two a lot today because it's very pertinent. So he was born and raised in a small village, which is right outside Nazareth. He did not see a movie until he was 20 years old. He graduated from Tel Aviv University, and one of the things you may recall is that we had have a sponsorship for the film festival from Friends of Tel Aviv University, and 4 of our films were directed by graduates of Tel Aviv University. And he had a dual degree in film studies and English literature because he really figured he would wind up being an English teacher. That was really his fallback. There were 9 kids in the family. Only 2 of them went to college at all. And he was very fortunate because he got a Fulbright fellowship to study filmmaking at Columbia University, where he earned his MFA in 2005. So that was really the beginning of his career. His work since then, since 2005, has been shown in many international film festivals: Cannes, Berlin, Locarno, Sundance, New York Film Festival. And his first film was a short film titled Be Quiet in 2005, and he won a prize at Cannes for that. And then he did a feature film debut called Man Without a Cell Phone in 2010, which also won some audience awards. His next feature was probably the one he's much better known for, which was called Under the Same Sun. It's a 2013 film, and it is available on Netflix, on Amazon Prime. I think it's free on Prime. And I do recommend it. I saw it a number of years ago, and I'm going to talk about it in a second. And then he wrote one other film that he did not direct called The Idol in 2015, which was directed by Hani Abu Assad, and that premiered at Toronto. And that is also available on Amazon. That might be $3.99, I'm not sure. But both of them are available, his 2 previous films. But his big film, 2018, Tel Aviv on Fire, was at the Toronto Film Festival and the 75th Venice International Film Festival. Kais Nefesh, who is the actor who plays Salam, he won the Best Actor prize at Venice. It was also at the Haifa International Film Festival, where it won Best Film, and at the Interfilm Best Film Award at the Venice Film Festival. So it's won numerous awards and been shown very widely. Zoabi is not only quite well known now as a filmmaker, but he is working as an adjunct professor at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts. He also teaches at Columbia in their MFA program. He lives in Brooklyn with his wife and their 2 children, and he teaches directing, production, and screenwriting. So he is really quite remarkable. Under the Same Sun, I want to mention the plots of the 2 films he did previously because I think they will show something about his thematic interests. So Under the Same Sun is set in the near future and looks back at how peace was made in 2013 between Israel and Palestine. And it's a story of 2 businessmen, one's Palestinian, one's Israeli, who set up a solar energy company together. And they come from societies where it's very frowned upon to cooperate with the other. And the film describes how they overcome their hostility from their own families and from the people around them through a Facebook campaign. They support the joint venture, which of course leads to the peace process. And it was quite a popular film, and I think it's very much worth seeing. It's not as accomplished as the film we just watched, but it is certainly thematically reveals how interested in the peace process and the problems of people to people relationships in Israel and Palestine. The mutual respect that the two men share in the movie is very similar, I think, to the story that we just watched in Tel Aviv on Fire, in which I think the essential notion is that we humanize the other. When we get to know each other personally, we humanize the other whose narrative we may be in conflict with, and that the sharing of the comedy allows us to grow an affection for both sides of the people on both sides of the conflict, and therefore humanizes it. And I think that's exactly what his earlier film was all about, these two men getting to know each other, and through that making this the case that peace is possible if people can treat each other as individuals and get to know each other. And so that's what this business partnership becomes, a partnership for peace. And then in The Idol, which he didn't direct, but he wrote, it's a fictionalized version of a true story. Mohammed Asaf was a wedding singer from a refugee camp in Gaza who in 2013 won Arab Idol in the singing competition. And so they fictionalize his story and tell his story in The Idol. So again, that's available, and you can watch that on Amazon. The one thing I wanted to mention about Zoabi's upbringing is that he says he was inspired to make a film about a soap opera because when he was growing up, there were 2 Arab stations on TV, and most of what was shown were soap operas, Palestinian soap operas. And there was, in fact, a program called Rafat al-Hagan, which ran from 1988 to 91. And it's about an Egyptian spy whose efforts were instrumental to Egypt's success in the 73 October War. It's also, therefore, the basis for the soap opera Tel Aviv on Fire, about a Palestinian spy who seduces an Israeli general. And it's basically the same story. And he says, Zoabi says, I was inspired to make a film with a soap opera in it because I was joking a lot. I now live in New York, and when I meet people and tell them I'm from the Middle East, they always ask me, how do you think this conflict is going to end? And I always say, I don't know. It feels like a soap opera. It never ends. It's one of those jokes where after a few times, I thought to myself, hey, there's a movie there. So that is the movie that you saw. So it was based very much on his familiarity with the soap opera conventions, and also about this whole idea that the art that is being created, and the film is very much about what is art and what is propaganda, but the art that's being created in Israel with and for and by Palestinians becomes very complicated. So to me, one of the things that I felt about the brilliance of using a soap opera as a background for the conflict in the Middle East is where we know the world of the soap opera very well. It's a world of duplicity. It's a world of artifice. It's a world of double crosses, of deceit, of power reversals, of bribery, of blackmail, of lies, of bribes, of acting versus reality. So the setting, I thought, of the soap opera was really a perfect metaphor for everything that's going on in the Middle East. In addition to the soap operas, Zoabi says he grew up watching Westerns and Egypt had a wonderful cinema. So he has a lot of affection for genre. And I think that this, among other things, is a wonderful skewering of the soap opera conventions and motifs, and was really was very is very funny, because we all kind of know what soap operas, what the universe of the soap opera is so beyond reality. You know, somebody gets decapitated in a car crash, but he's back the next season because there's now a new, you know. So there's nothing more absurd than a soap opera, and so I think that the over the topness lends itself very well. Yet I also have to say that this is a very daring film, because to make a comedy about the situation in the Middle East is certainly a risky proposition. And I'm going to talk now a little bit about some of the conflicts and problems that existed for him to make the film. First of all, he did have a writing partner. Dan Kleinman is a professor of his from Columbia University. And so often people would ask Zoabi, oh, did you need him to write the Jewish parts? And he always jokes, no, he writes the Palestinian parts and I write the Jewish parts, because we really know each, you know, our observations of the other are actually better. But Dan Kleinman lives in the United States. He's not an Israeli. He's not even particularly very Jewishly identified, but he is a very good screenwriter, teaches screenwriting. And so I think Zoabi benefited a great deal from his expertise, but absolutely the point of view is Zoabi's. It's not like this is a story that was co-written, really co-created. They work together, but it is absolutely Zoabi's story. And he also says that he felt a lot of pressure to tell stories that offered a particular kind of narrative that was expected of him, and that he thought was erroneous. And he really had to fight to tell a story that he felt was honest and genuine and came from his own perspective. And I think it's very interesting that, to me, what this story is about from a dramatic point of view is a man who finds his voice. In the beginning, he claims he's a writer, but he doesn't even know where to begin. You know, he sits there like all other writers in movies with a blank page on the typewriter or the computer and can't get started, and is trying to eavesdrop. He has no idea to become a writer. But once he does start to write, he discovers his own voice. And we'll talk a little bit about the checkpoints in a bit, but that's what allows him to gain the power, to reverse, you know, the checkpoint guard kind of has him over a barrel until he doesn't really need him anymore, because he's found his own voice. So I think this is a story about a man who found his own voice. And I think the filmmaker himself, in doing this, it is very much his own story. It is a production of Luxembourg, Israel, France, and Belgium. Those are the countries that produced the film. And he couldn't submit the film as Palestinian because he is actually an Israeli citizen. Zoabi, like Salam, lives in Jerusalem, although the reason he has to go through the checkpoints all the time is because it's in Ramallah, it's being filmed in Ramallah, but he has dual citizenship, so he's going back and forth. And so there's all this tension that goes on in the film world, like I said before, about cooperation. And Zoabi said that he says that he wanted this really to be a story based in humor, and that was his choice. And he said, I wanted to follow the path of Billy Wilder, Ernst Lubitsch, and Charlie Chaplin, who all countered rising fascism, pervasive poverty, and rapid industrialization of the era with a laugh. So this is, to me, one of the most amusing anecdotes I've ever heard about any film. They filmed most of this in Luxembourg and created the set in Luxembourg, except for the checkpoint itself. They created a checkpoint, the outdoor checkpoint, in Israel. And when it got constructed for the filming, it was protested by a group of European activists who thought it was a real checkpoint. So they had to deal with actually a protest of their fake checkpoint, the facsimile in Israel. But he wanted to tell the story, with humor, but he couldn't get it shown as, it was really a question of whether, is it an Israeli film or is it a Palestinian film? And in recent years, there's been a huge amount of conflict over this. There was a Palestinian-Israeli Arab director who had a film, her name is Raida Adon, and she had a short film called Strangeness. And it was expelled from the Palestinian Film Festival in Paris because she'd received funding from Israel. And then there was another film, Personal Affairs, that was thrown out of a festival in Beirut on orders of the Lebanese government because of its Israeli seal. So, and then in Israel, there was a municipality called on the Arab community to boycott the movie In Between. So whatever side you're on, you're on the wrong side, and it made it very difficult for him to show the film, and he got criticized on both sides for it. And in fact, there was another filmmaker who made a film that she presented as a Palestinian film, and she was nearly asked to reimburse the Israel Film Fund with millions of shekels. And then also Ajami, if you remember the film Ajami, that was attacked because just before the Oscars, he denied his Israeli branding, the director. And then there was a whole problem with the film Janine. So there's been a history of Palestinian and Israeli co-productions that then have had a real problem because of the funding, et cetera. And this is what Zouani says. This whole business of being a Palestinian who lives in Israel, makes films about Israel, and received money from an Israeli fund, well, the Palestinians want to know how you conduct yourself with this. The Europeans want to have you find balance in the film, and the Israelis also examine you, he told in an interview. So I said to myself, every time you make a film, you're under a microscope. The Palestinians look at whether your stories are Palestinian enough or too Israeli. And the Israelis are forever worried about how they're depicted. And if you get money from the fund, they say, we give him money and he makes films about us, so what is he? Is he for us or against us? And when I realized that this dilemma will always be part of a filmmaking deal, I decided, okay, I'll make a film about that. So he actually incorporates this whole problem in the film. When people see the last film in the scene, he says, they ask, what is Sameh saying here from a political perspective? An Israeli who sees the film says, wow, we're giving money to Palestinians to make films and they say bad things about us. Whereas the Palestinian says, he takes money from the Israelis and makes films that only they like. So for the director, this is stressful. You know that people are waiting, looking for something to attack you about. We're always between a rock and a hard place. And I know this from all our directors, especially those born in Israel. So learning more about the background made me even happier that I was showing this film, because it was a very difficult journey for him to be on, to bring this story to the screen. And I think it does a great deal of service in terms of humanizing and using humor to make fun of sort of all sides of the situation. So the last comment I want to make is about comedy, and then I'd like to hear from you a little bit and get into some questions. But the whole question of whether there are subjects that cannot be dealt with humor. The Holocaust is obviously a huge example of this, and the movie that probably brought out this conversation the most was Life is Beautiful many years ago. And I personally did not like that film at all. I thought it trivialized the Holocaust. I thought the whole, I was very, very negative on that film. A lot of people liked it. It was very popular, and there's an argument to be made. I would not make the argument that humor cannot be used. And I would say that Jojo Rabbit was one of my favorite movies of this past year. And if you haven't seen it, I do recommend that you watch it. There are some very, very funny comparisons between the film that we just watched and Jojo Rabbit. But I do think that it is always extremely fraught with risk when you address very, very serious subjects with humor. But I certainly think that Charlie Chaplin's The Great Dictator and Jojo Rabbit are very much in the same vein. And I thought that the humor worked really beautifully here. Here is something about him personally that there's an article about him that says he is as deliberate as he is optimistic. And I think that's an interesting choice for someone who is Palestinian or Israeli to use the word optimistic, because he's certainly not optimistic about the prospects for peace. He's certainly not, this is not that kind of optimism, but he says he is really he wants to use comedy because humor allows people to, quote, loosen up a little bit and look at their reality differently. But he adds, if the humor doesn't translate, you're screwed. And that really kind of is the point. But I came across this quote and I thought this was so interesting. He says that his own personality leads him to humor. And he describes himself as an optimist and says that his upbringing has had a significant impact on the tone of his films. He says, my family laughs all the time, and he describes Palestinians as having a great sense of humor. My family, they never really linger on misery. It's a way of survival. Now, does that sound familiar to anybody? I mean, Jews are noted for using humor as a coping strategy, as a means of survival. That is absolutely what we're known for. So to see the Palestinian feeling the same way, that the troubles, the best thing to do is to joke about them in some ways, is, to me, another point of another way that the film humanizes both sides. And what I liked about the film a lot is that it wasn't heavy-handed. It was over the top, but it wasn't heavy-handed in terms of propaganda. All the points were really quite subtly made. I think that the sentence that I like the best in it is close to the end, when he's sort of under attack from both sides. He says, Salam says, is there nothing between bombs and surrender? And I think what he's trying to do, and so many people are trying to do, is find a middle ground, find a common ground, find something that isn't only one side or another. His uncle, who I think was hilariously played, who was always trying to inject the Palestinian cause into the script. He says, with our reality, there is no Romeo and Juliet. Well, Romeo and Juliet was a tragedy, So yes, there is very much Romeo and Juliet, and this is a story of a man, as I said, who finds his own voice, and in doing that, there's a power reversal that he comes into his own, and he learns how to kind of express what he believes, and to find his own path. And it's very interesting to me that he has the option to leave and to go to Paris with the actress, and he rejects that. And not to say that there was a right or a wrong decision. I don't think it was about that. I think the rejection of that was to say there are options. I mean, he himself lives in Brooklyn and teaches in the United States. People do leave and move on, but then there are people who make the choice to say that's their home, and the only problem, the problem is there's the occupation, and it's a problem for both sides. And I think that's really what the film so nimbly dealt with, is both sides of this equation, and the the challenge of keeping your humanity and trying to do some work that is real and meaningful in the light of it. So I'd love to get some questions. And Nancy, do you have some questions or people you want to unmute, or where do you want to go from here?
Well, let's start with a few of the questions that have been chatted to you already. Diane Denberg wrote that she loves that Salam ate hummus at the end to symbolize that finding his voice and healing his childhood trauma. And Diane's also looking for some good hummus if anyone has any to share with her.
I have a great recipe. It's called, what's his name? Solomonov, the guy from Philadelphia who wrote the book, Michael
Solomonov.
Yes. He has a 10-minute hummus recipe that I use all the time that's great. It was in Hadassah magazine. I'm sure you can Google it somehow. But yeah, so one of my questions was, what does the hummus symbolize? And there is actually, Zawabi actually talks about that a little bit. He says, let me see if I can find the actual, oh yeah, the hummus thing. Here's the hummus. Here's the hummus quote from him. So he says, the hummus idea was a whole story in itself. The conflict over hummus is at the core of it. Everyone knows that the best hummus is made by Palestinians, and people will drive for hours to get to Nazareth to get it. But then you come to the US and you go to the grocery store, and there you see Sabra, an Israeli hummus, and you realize that this is a joke. It's systemic. Part of the occupation and not acknowledging the other is taking their food. In other words, cultural appropriation. So now, in the world conscience, hummus is an Israeli food. By nature, you can start to forget that the food originally was Palestinian and that Palestinians never existed. It's erasing history. This, you know, and he goes on. Asi thinks he's a great expert on hummus, but when Salam makes it from a can with some lemon, it proves he doesn't know. Those ideas stem from political discussions we have on a daily basis, and I found room for it in the film. Of course, Salam will bribe Asi with hummus, and he will accept it because Israelis are obsessed with hummus. But is it because of the hummus itself, or is it the idea that hummus has become theirs now? So even something as innocent and funny as hummus is incredibly weighted politically. And I think Diane is exactly right that the healing of the trauma from childhood, he's, as you remember, he says there was such bad hummus that, you know, at that time, he's remembering a time of great deprivation and all they had was these bad cans of hummus. So he lost his appetite for it. But now, and it's so funny, she says that he's, you know, finding his voice, as I said, there has to be a healing that goes on. He has to realize that it's the food, it is both, it is food for both. You can't really say anymore whether it's Israeli or Palestinian because the two cultures are so enmeshed. And some of you may remember a number of years ago, there was a short film called West Bank Story that won the Academy Award for short film. And it was West Side Story reimagined between a Palestinian falafel stand and a Israeli falafel stand next to each other, and it's the same West Side Story, but on the West Bank. And so there, very clearly, the ownership of the food, the shared culture, the shared language, is very much part of that history. I'd be curious to know what other people think the hummus symbolizes. But if anybody has any other thoughts about what hummus symbolizes in the movie, I'm happy to hear that.
We did get a few comments that hummus represented like the innocence of, you know, the end of when he had the trauma when he was 6. That was kind of like the end of the innocence that he was experiencing. Diane also threw out there that kind of hummus and food in general is something that always brings people together across cultures. But Kathryn, you related that it's also the whole idea about cultural appropriation. This kind of, this is like the flip side of that coin in terms of food. Elizabeth popped in to say that Asi says that he does want the Palestinian hummus because it's better, even though his palate really can't tell the difference. So kind of that cultural acknowledgement that even though, we take on the hummus as the Israeli food, there is this acknowledgement that there is some kind of barrier maybe that we can't reach.
Right. So the whole thing at that checkpoint is very interesting because there's a power dynamic. Obviously, both in the film and in reality, the Israelis have the upper hand. There's no question about where the power is in the checkpoint. And in fact, it's interesting, there was a documentary some of you may have seen back in 2013 called Checkpoint. And it's an Israeli documentary. And it was basically, they set up cameras at the checkpoint and just really wanted to record what went on so that they could craft a film that showed clearly that this was the checkpoints are a really bad thing and the Palestinians are badly treated and humiliated. And so they set up cameras, and it was a very interesting documentary. But sometimes documentaries can reveal things they don't necessarily intend to reveal. And certainly what they revealed is the reality of both sides being in an impossible situation. The 19-year-old, Israeli soldier who's being, confronted in extremely hostile ways and doesn't really know how to respond. And it's really a hard movie to watch in some ways. But there's a moment at which a Palestinian man's on camera, and he's very angry, and he says, "Tell me, do I look like a terrorist? Why am I being treated? Do I look like a terrorist?" And I'm thinking, yeah, kind of. I mean, what does, that's the whole point. We don't know what a terrorist looks like. So, this man really thinks that he should just be, he could just cross because he clearly doesn't look like a terrorist. So it really reveals, the complexity of that situation. So what is it that then flips it? So first of all, Sameh, he needs to get across, he needs to get to work. He's really, he's willing to lie and say he's the writer, and then he actually needs the guard to help him create the story. But later on in the story, and he has to even bribe the guy to help him by bringing him the better hummus, which is Palestinian, which everybody knows is better, and therefore, as has been pointed out, an acknowledgement of that. But he then realizes towards the end he doesn't need the guy anymore because he can write his own story. And he has it all figured out, and he's really taking charge of his own destiny, which I think is an important part of the story. And then, yes, he can eat the hummus himself because he's now sort of more the master of his own destiny. And the romance is kind of a sweet little thing that he's proven himself to be, to sort of stand up and speak. And even though what he's speaking is in a sitcom, as a soap opera, at least it doesn't end with a bomb going off or the wedding taking place. There's really, they've locked themselves into a story they can't get out of. How could it possibly end? And then they come up with a clever ending that somehow reconciles and brings everybody together.
So Kathryn, you mentioned about the romance as that being a kind of another element to the story, and Diane, with the great hummus question, also raised the question about the role of women in the story, and his mother plays a role, Miriam, the actress, even the hairdresser, costume woman. They do kind of play important leading roles in the story, and maybe you can address some of that.
Right. By the way, the woman who plays the costume designer, who then angles to get herself in the next season, if anyone saw Fauda, Did people watch Fauda? She was the Palestinian doctor who then falls in love with the main character in Fauda, but so that actress is she's gorgeous, by the way. She's fabulous. Yeah, the role of women is interesting, because here's where I really liked the checkpoint guard, because you can kind of tell that his wife he's really trying to impress his wife, that his wife is driving this. And when she says to him, "Oh, this guy is so romantic. He's a dashing. Yes, he's a terrorist, of course, but but he's a very handsome terrorist." And he then wants to create a more sympathetic character of the Israeli general, but then he introduces the Holocaust, and then that, of course, is not okay, because you can't humanize the Israeli character. So the minute the writer thinks it might be okay from a dramatic point of view, wouldn't you want your characters to be flesh and blood and to have their own story? But if that runs afoul of the propaganda, it's a problem for the Palestinians. So he's trying to please his wife, stroke his own ego at the same time. And so again, it's sort of, he's successful in not really in what he's successful in is with his wife. And that seems to be, again, this humanizing thing. He's a guy who at home, he's just trying to get a little more respect, right? And the woman that Salam is in love with, who obviously they had some, he didn't rise to the occasion in their previous whatever, she comes to respect him too. So I think that it's a lot about respect, and and getting the respect of the female is the ultimate kind of, both men are actually trying to get the respect of the female rather than of each other, which I think is kind of interesting.
So speaking of respect, Matt Young had an idea about the film, that maybe this was like a savior movie that was written from the point of the view of the other. Matt uses the term, he phrased it as like a white savior movie told from the point of view of the Indians. So I'm not sure what Matt means in terms of who's the savior here and all of those, but I wanted to throw that out to you.
Well, the savior thing is interesting, because they really kind of rescue each other. But what I think is interesting is that they go back and forth between Hebrew and Arabic, which our ears may not pick up on all the time, in the same way that, the hummus is sort of the, but there are two languages going on. And what Wayne and Jackie were noticing too is the music does the same thing. There's kind of the Arabic and the Israeli music that kind of jumps around. So you get this kind of, this culture clash thing. But I'm not, in terms of the savior, he is more, to me, the unlikely hero. He is the nebbish who makes good, who stands up and finds his voice, which again is a very Jewish character. And it's interesting because the other movie you didn't get to see was Born in Jerusalem and Still Alive. And in that film, there's a nebbishy Israeli guy who also finds his voice and kind of comes onto his own and wins the girl in the process. So there's a lot of overlap between the two stories, but certainly the kind of nebbish, he's sort of the cliche of the nephew of the uncle who's successful, and they give him a job as a gopher. He's there really to make coffee, and but because he speaks both Hebrew and English and Arabic, he's able to be of service. And the whole thing about explosive, you look explosive, was so funny to me, because of course there's also another word that that I was reading about in Hebrew, when you say you're a bombshell, but it's the same as the bomb, it's the same thing, but she's a bombshell. And then he says it to the Israeli soldier, and she's not happy with that terminology. So
Kathryn, Matt clarified that he thought that maybe the Israeli officer was trying to be the savior in this case.
Yeah, I think he sort of sees himself perhaps as a coming to the rescue or whatever. But I think there's sort of a humbling that takes place on all sides. I think that it's not as easy to make a sitcom, to make a soap opera as you might think. The writing and the dialogue is an absolute talent that he has to sort of pull out of himself. He has to to write something, it has to sort of come from within, and that involves an opening up and therefore a vulnerability. But in the creation of art, there's always this conflict between propaganda and art. If you want the show to be good, what does it take? And what's in the best interest of the show? And you see the character struggling between, oh, well, that's not acceptable. We can't have, the two get married because that would not be acceptable. But there is no acceptable story. So I think that in the beginning, he might think of himself as a savior, but I think in the end, it's more all about collaboration and cooperation, which to make any kind of art, you have to have. So it takes, a lot of fingers in the pot. And then in Arab later it plays the languages too, and in misunderstanding, yeah. So someone else is pointing out Arab labor, and in that the language problems and it's poetry is that which gets lost in translation, is a famous quote, and humor is the second thing that gets lost in translation after poetry. And so the fact that he could make a film that was funny to Palestinians, funny to Israelis, and funny to Americans and Europeans is really quite a testament.
Charles, I think, has the last question for today, which is about the relationship between Salam and his uncle. The little nephew finally makes good.
Right. I mean, it is sort of, without being overplayed, it's a story of manhood. It's a story of maturation. It's a story of, it's not just his voice that he finds, but I think that his uncle, by the way, that's quite a well-known Palestinian actor that plays the uncle, and I thought he was hilarious. And I think the universality of bad art is something that is a great source of humor in we all know what these, when she rolls her eyes or it transcends cultures. It's amusing to us to know that Palestinians have just as bad taste as we do when it comes to this kind of acting and story and fantasy. So I think that his uncle kind of represents the old guard, art as propaganda, that you have an opportunity to send a message, and so of course she's going to blow herself up, and that's the proper ending. But he rejects that, so he's rejecting a political ending as well. He's sort of trying to find his own middle ground, and it's not just his relationship with his uncle, but what is the show going to say to both audiences? Because it's true that the Palestinian soap operas were watched by Israelis. So again, like the hummus, when you're all consuming the same products, whether it's soap operas or hummus, but they taste different to you, or you have different perceptions, so it's both about the things that make us the same and the things that make us different. And I thought that was really very delightful.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. Before we leave, do you want to give everybody a little summary about what the movie is about for next week's Talkback?
So next week, we're going to look at Fiddler, Miracle of Miracles, and that's a wonderful one to have a Talkback. We did get one Talkback in because we had 3 screenings and showed only the first one. and the audience loved the film. It's very rich because there's a lot to talk about with Fiddler itself, as well as this particular film about it, and the current production that many people have seen in Yiddish that's playing. So we're going to have a very interesting conversation about Fiddler. You might want to go back and watch Fiddler as well as the documentary about it, and I'm looking forward to that talk back as well. And I think that what maybe we'll make sure we try to do, Nancy and I, is to make sure we have some questions up front, because as we go through this, it's kind of hard to do it as we're moving. So we'll make sure we get some questions from you up front. Sarah Jane had submitted one question up front, and I want to just make sure that we touch on that. She was asking about the reality of the checkpoints, and wasn't it kind of uncomfortable? And the one thing that I wanted to say, because it was a wonderful comment, and Sarah Jane is always one of my favorite contributors in our talkbacks. And what I wanted to say about this film is, everything makes me uncomfortable. If you're not uncomfortable at a checkpoint, where are you going to be uncomfortable? And so humor very often comes out of being in the most uncomfortable place possible, because there is no, there is no escape. There is no comfort. So I think it's very deliberately flirting with that absolute sense of almost danger, that, really this could get ugly. And he has said, if I showed you the reality of what actually went on, this would be a very different movie. But you all know there's a scene when a boy comes in handcuffs, and they say, I'll get to him later. You know that out there's sort of a darker reality looming beyond the set of the soap opera. There is a harsh reality that does kind of intrude on it, but that within the soap opera, there is a kind of rapprochement. So, yes,
so that was a good plug.
It should make you uncomfortable a little bit.
Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. And
wonderful.
The talkback is next week at the same time, same bat channel, but you will need to register so that you can get the link. And if you have questions regarding the documentary, if you want to send them to me or to Kathryn in advance, then that would be great. And thank you very much. And we appreciate everybody.
Is the link different from today's link?
Yes.
Yes.
A different link.
Different link.
Also, our Facebook page, if people are watching any of the other films from Menemsha Films, please, we invite you to use our Facebook page to make comments. I just watched this and I thought it was fabulous, or whatever, and start recommending titles to each other, because we can talk among ourselves in addition to, me. So do think about that. And please don't hesitate. My email is BJFF, Boulder Jewish Film Festival, BJFF@boulderjcc.org. So please, if you have comments or things you wanted to say, or things I'm here. So please feel free to reach out to me by email as well.